Hey dudes, my name's Blako, and I've been working on my slightly different online multiplayer dungeon crawler, KIRO II, the Wizard's Guild, where you type commands and your player reacts in real time. It was developed in Godot, and I just released it a few days ago on Steam. I'm pretty happy to release another game again, since even though I've kinda been working non-stop the past few years on game development, it's actually been a few years since I've finished and released my last one, and I wanted to make this one to sort of force myself to work on something I could finish and release in a somewhat short amount of time. Also, I've never released a multiplayer game before, so I wanted to do something a little different, but also familiar, so that's why I made the sequel to my original game KIRO. And even though I've done a lot of networking before for my traditional software engineering jobs, I ended up learning a lot about working on the networking for this project, and just in general for how I'd set up multiplayer games in the future. I say the game is finished, but I'll probably still add stuff to it every now and then, since the game is pretty easily expandable. But yeah, now that it's done, I just wanted to reflect on how everything went, and just go through some questions to sort of share my experience. I'll put some timestamps so you can skip around. How long did it take you to develop and release the game on Steam? It took about 4.5 months to make the game from start to finish, but it also took a lot of time to make the devlogs and setting up the Steam page with all the required images. I usually struggle through making art for my games, so that's where a lot of my time went. I'd probably break those 4.5 months down to something like this. 10% for setting up the store page with all the images and making the automated build pipeline, 30% for making all the animations for sprites and tile sets, 5% for making all the item definitions for all the weapons and armor with the inventory system, 15% for making and editing devlogs, 30% for programming, and 10% for researching on how to do certain things in Godot with the Steam SDK. I usually feel like most of the time working on a game is spent making assets, but this game was programming heavy because it was a networked multiplayer game. What were the biggest challenges you faced during the development process? I think for this game, the hardest part was working with the Steam SDK and just getting everything to work how I wanted. I used a lot of features from Steam using the Godot Steam plugin, so to even use the plugin, you either have to build Godot from source, or you use one of their pre-built versions since it's written in C++. I went with building Godot from source because it lets me choose which version I want, and if I want to add more C++ plugins, then I can. It was pretty easy to get up and running with a lobby system with the plugin and the test projects they provide, which is a great start, but there's a ton of work to make sure players have a smooth experience and that everything runs properly on all of the clients. Also, I wanted to use Steam's inventory service, and I greatly appreciate the Godot Steam plugin, but some of the functions in the plugin didn't work right with the Steam SDK for using the inventory service, at least for the version I was using. So I ended up having to fix the C++ code in the plugin and rebuild Godot quite a few times to get everything to work properly. Also, it's kind of a pain to work with some of the features within Steam systems because there's a ton of settings to just get it set up in the web portal to even work at all. But yeah, I'd say the networking and the inventory system were the hardest part to get working right. How did you approach marketing your game before and after release on Steam? I kinda failed on this part. I did make devlogs for the game, but they didn't do all that well, and I think one of the biggest reasons is that this game is just hard to market, which might mean it's not a good game, but I think the game is actually pretty fun if you play it with some friends. At least I've had a lot of fun playing it, but it's really hard to show a game being fun if it doesn't stand out with some unique style or just look impressive in some way. But yeah, for marketing, I made the devlogs, and then I also set up some advertising on Reddit since I got a free $100 credit. And I also posted where I could to Reddit with custom tailored posts for each type of subreddit. I spent a lot of time to follow the rules of each subreddit, and even though I followed all the rules, a lot of the subreddits still remove my posts. And I don't have much of a Twitter following, so it doesn't really do much there. Have you received any feedback from players yet? If so, what have they said about your game? Nope, just kidding. I mean, most of the people that actually play it have had fun with it, but I think the hardest part is just to actually get someone to try it out. especially because it's just a lot more fun with other people. What advice would you give to someone who's just starting out developing their indie game? Well, I think the biggest thing is that unless it's just a project for fun, or it's just something you really want to make in a certain style, I think to get the game out to a bigger audience, you really have to think about who's actually going to want to play the game. This kind of determines early on how much of a success you could possibly get when you finish and release your game. For example, with this game, my audience is only people who are on PC, like typing games, dungeon crawlers, fantasy games, and old school 2D graphics. Each little thing narrows down my audience to where there's only so many people that would be interested in it. I could increase the audience by just changing a few little things, like taking out the requirement for PC games and typing games, and suddenly I just have a fantasy dungeon crawler with old school 2D graphics, which is a much larger audience. But then, if instead of old school 2D graphics, I chose 3D modern graphics, well then suddenly my game is basically dark and darker, which that game is massively popular, if it can ever actually release. So step 1, finding the audience I want with the type of game I make, but then step 2, deciding on a style that would be visually appealing to my chosen audience. With a visually appealing style, then suddenly my devlogs would do a lot better, because the devlogs would be styled like how my larger audience would want, which with more views comes more wish lists as the devlogs continue, and it sorta would just turn out as a much bigger success at the end of everything. So yeah, I guess just in general thinking about how a game would be marketed early on would help out later as the game is being made and when it's finally released. Still, it's fine to make a game completely for yourself if you just have that expectation that it might not really do as well. Anyway, I think that's enough reflection time. That's all I got. See ya!